All right, let's talk about vSphere clusters. We'll look at the benefits of clusters, and we'll actually create a cluster and then view the information about a cluster. So this is just the introduction here to some of the features that a cluster can give us. So what is a cluster? Well, the first thing is that it's an inventory object in vCenter. You'll find clusters in the Hosts and Clusters view. And all you have to do is right-click on a data center and select New Cluster. And at this point, the cluster itself has a series of features and a wizard that you can walk through to actually configure the cluster and add your ESXi hosts to that cluster. Now, in most organizations, there will be several clusters. Okay? You might have a cluster for your management systems. That is, all of your vSphere stuff, maybe your Active Directory stuff ends up in a management cluster. All of your monitoring tools that you have in the environment. Anything that helps you to run the operations of your data center ends up in a management cluster. You might have a production cluster, and this is where your virtual machines will run that help you to run the organization. Sometimes we'll call this a production cluster. Some people simply call this a compute cluster. Sometimes you'll have a staging cluster where you are preparing systems to go into production. Maybe you'll have a testing cluster where you're testing changes that you might later make to production. And all of these things can be kept separate, or they can be brought together. It's really up to you how you might organize this cluster for your own needs. Okay? A cluster itself can contain up to 64 ESXi hosts with up to 8,000 virtual machines on a single cluster. So that's pretty significant. Now, when we create this cluster and we have all of these features that we decide to add, all of the hosts in that cluster then aggregate those resources when we turn on features like vSphere DRS. And what vSphere DRS allows us to do is to ensure that all of the virtual machines running on the hosts in the cluster are spread apart such that no single host is overloaded and cannot provide the resources that a virtual machine needs. So that's vSphere DRS. vSphere HA is another feature in a cluster where the cluster monitors itself to ensure that all of the hosts themselves are healthy. And if a host is not healthy or if a host has crashed, it restarts those virtual machines that have gone down with that host. It restarts them on other hosts in the cluster. vSAN is another cluster feature where we can take not only the compute resources of a cluster, that's the CPU and memory, but we can also aggregate its internal storage devices to create one large vSAN data store. And we've already spoken about this. So this screenshot here shows you a new cluster. And this new cluster wizard simply says, hey, let's give it a name and select the features that we want in a cluster. One of the nice new features of a cluster in vSphere 7 is that we can manage all of the hosts in a cluster with a single ESXi image. That is an ESXi core along with drivers and firmware updates and things like that, and then manage it through vSphere Lifecycle Manager. We're going to talk about vSphere Lifecycle Manager in the next module, that's module 10, to wind up the course. Now, with the release of vSphere 6.7 Update 1, I believe it was, a really great feature got added to vSphere clusters. And that's the ability to create clusters with something called the Cluster Quick Start system. And the Cluster Quick Start workflow takes you from start to finish with all of the features and all of the networking requirements that you need to create a cluster for vSphere DRS, vSphere HA, and vSAN. Okay? At the end of this particular module, or the end of our vSphere HA lessons, I'm actually going to show you a little video and walk you through the Cluster Quick Start features. So stay tuned for that. You can also create a cluster manually by simply creating the cluster object in vCenter and clicking the OK button. Then you'll click on the cluster itself and click Configure. And then you can go through all of the features of vSphere cluster and turn them on or turn them off or configure them. And you can see all of the different configuration options that we have here. You can actually launch the cluster quick start wizard. You can look at security and licensing and enhanced vMotion compatibility. And you can set DRS affinity rules that we'll be talking about in the next lesson. All kinds of great stuff that we can either do automatically when we create the cluster with the cluster quick start wizard, or we can then go back and make modifications or simply configure it manually in the more traditional fashion that we've been doing for many years. Once your cluster has been created, we need to start adding some resources to the cluster. And that's simply done by dragging and dropping your ESXi hosts into the cluster. Okay? Once you have at least 3 hosts in a cluster, or 2 hosts in a cluster, you have all kinds of great features available in the cluster. You get more features available when you have 3 hosts in the cluster, where we can do things like vSphere, vSAN. Okay? Once the cluster has been built, click on the cluster, go to the Summary tab, and you get to see all kinds of information about that cluster. You can see its aggregate CPU availability, its current utilization. You can see the same thing for memory. You can see the storage capacity available to all the data stores that are connected to all of the hosts in the cluster. You can get a nice summary of the resources in terms of how many hosts are in the cluster, if is EVC turned on, and at what level have you set the baseline for EVC. You can see how many virtual machines and vApps and resource pools are created in a cluster. Okay? All kinds of really great features right here on the Summary tab of your vSphere cluster. On the Monitor tab, you can monitor the entire cluster's set of resources as well. Are there virtual machines running in the cluster? What are the settings on each of those virtual machines? Are there reservations or limits and shares created on the cluster? What are the VMs that are powered on? Is the cluster itself balanced in terms of virtual machines spread across the cluster with vSphere DRS? All of this stuff can be looked at under the monitoring section of a cluster. One last thing to say, and this is a best practice, though not a technical requirement. When you create a cluster, you want to do as best you can to ensure that the hosts in the cluster are, if not absolutely identical, are very similar to one another. They should be the same CPUs if at all possible. They should have about the same amount of RAM if at all possible. They should all have access to the same set of shared storage if at all possible. This will go a long way to ensuring that all of those features like DRS and HA and enhanced vMotion compatibility, all of those features will actually work to their best and most efficient extent. Okay? So that's the basics of a cluster. And when we come back, we're going to look at vSphere DRS, which is that really cool feature that allows us to ensure that all of the virtual machines across the cluster get access to all of the resources they need. Okay? We'll come back in just a second with lesson number 2.